So for those of you who have been reading the Parsha or have been with me these last few weeks, you know that we've been on a rather depressing journey, a downward spiral of Bnei Israel. And last week we had a little respite from that because we took a detour away from the Israelites and read about Parshat Balak, which is the story of a Moabite king, Balak, and also a Midianite prophet, Balaam, who is evil. So we got to see things from the point of view of other than from Israelites, which is a real interesting thing to see it through the other's eyes. Not only does it reveal what their hopes and fears and issues are, but it also can tell us how they view us from a completely different point of view. So that was interesting. And I tried to figure out why the Parshas in Torah. And I think that's a good reason, so that we get a point of view other than just through our own eyes. But I think the other more important reason is because the week before we had read about Korach and the dangers of a certain type of speech and rhetoric, which can be very persuasive, but which has an inauthentic impetus. In other words, Korach's concerns were not for getting a truth or for l'shem shamayim, we say, for the sake of heaven, but rather his own personal concerns, self-aggrandizement, greed, status, ambition. And then we meet Balaam the following week, and we see that he has very similar concerns. And we're able to see that if that's unleashed on the world and on us, what type of havoc that can wreak havoc and destruction. Last week's Parsha ended with 24,000 Israelites dying. He couldn't get them by cursing them and causing destruction that way. So he got them by other destructive means that are even more insidious. So actually, the Parsha this week starts where last week left off, but it's important to just go over a little bit of the last chapter in last week's Parsha, where we're introduced to Pinchas. So Pinchas is the Israelite who stopped the desecration of the Mishkan by impaling Zimri, who was a leader, actually a prince from the tribe of Shimon, and Cosbi, who was a daughter of a leader of Midian when they were engaging in lewd acts inside the Mishkan and in the sight of Moshe and all of Bnei Israel. So right before that, we learned that Bnei Israel had traveled to Shittim. So they left the protective environment of the desert where it was just the Israelites and no one else. And now they're in Shittim, they're surrounded by Moabites. And for some reason, what happens is that the Moabite women seduce the Israelite men, they eat and drink together. And not only do they seduce them sexually, but they also get them to go after the foreign gods, specifically Baal Peor. So two of the most terrible occurrences in all of Torah happen in just a brief couple verses last week, which is sexual immorality and avodah zarah, idol worship. So how can this happen? Which is a question we ask every week, actually, it seems. The other thing to note this week is that Wednesday night was the start of the 17th of Tammuz. It's a fast day. It ended Thursday night. And the 17th of Tammuz starts what is known in Judaism as a period of the 3 weeks, which is a very sad time and a time of mourning. It's the day that we associate with the walls of the temple being breached. And there's also a few other calamities that are associated with that date. So for example, our sages say that Moshe broke the tablets at Mount Sinai on the 17th of Tammuz, that the daily Tamid offering that was supposed to be an eternal offering, that stopped on the 17th of Tammuz. As I said, the city walls and also leading to the breach of the temple walls happened on the 17th of Tammuz. This was part of the Roman siege of Jerusalem. And another tragedy that happened on that day was that the Roman military leader, Postumus, burned a Torah scroll publicly in the sight of everyone. And an idol was erected inside the temple. So these are shocking and sad and calamitous occurrences, and they correspond with what happened with Zimri and Cosby. Because as we were told, this was not an act that was performed in private or even publicly in a place that was not considered a holy place. This was an act that almost had an ingredient of defiance to it, which I'll talk about a little later. So you know that I rely on Dr. Aviva Zornberg for a lot of help with interpretation, and I find her teachings just wonderful and enlightening. The title of her chapter on this week's Parsha, on Parshat Pinchas, is To Be or Not to Be, A Tale of Five Sisters, referring to the daughters of Zelophehad. And I'm not really going to concentrate on the daughters of Zelophehad. I'll say a little bit as I need to show some interesting comparisons between the story of Pinchas and the daughters of Zelophehad. So I won't really be using her too much as a source today, but I would like to talk a little bit about this title of To Be or Not to Be. So the quotation is from Shakespeare, obviously, and it's from Hamlet. And I think it refers to not just one important existential choice made in our Parsha, which is the petition of the daughters of Zelophehad, but I think it's also reflected in our first hero, which is Pinchas. So our first hero is Pinchas, and then we've got our heroines, the daughters of Zelophehad. Both of them overcome Hamlet's dilemma of indecision, which I say results from analysis paralysis. So as I said, at the end of last week's Parsha, we're introduced to Pinchas, and I'll just read the quotation, which introduces him and sets up exactly what he did. Behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman near to his brothers in the sight of Moshe and in the sight of the entire assembly of the children of Israel, and they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So we don't know their names yet. We don't know what they were doing, but we know that all of Bnei Yisrael was crying. So obviously this was a shocking act, and it put everyone in a tailspin. What is striking about this particular pasuk, this verse, is that we see Moshe here apparently in a state of confusion, which results in his inaction and his inability to speak. He does respond, however, when God gives an instruction in reaction to what happened. But we are left wondering why Moshe had not spoken up or given instructions before this point. So we learn that a plague had already been going on only after we're told that it was halted. So the question remains, where was Moshe when these activities started, and why was he unable to intercede before God speaks to him? And then once again, while witnessing the actions of Zimri and Cosby. So our sages try to answer this question in many ways. For example, we know that Moshe's wife was a Midianite, just like Cosby. Moshe's wife was the daughter of Yitro, who was a Midianite Cohen. So our sages explain that this could be why he was reluctant to make a judgment about Zimri consorting with Cosby for fear of being thought a hypocrite. So there's an interesting midrash about this. While this was going on, while Cosby was in with the Israelite, we think having sex by the altar in the Mishkan, that there's a midrash that Moshe perhaps did say something. How can you be doing this? And Zimri's answer is, well, is this woman permitted to me or not permitted to me? So Moshe immediately understands that if the woman is permitted, then what he's doing, even though geographically it's a big problem, according to the law, it wouldn't be a problem. But if she's not permitted to him, then the question becomes, well, if she's not permitted to me, Zimri would say to Moshe, then why are you permitted to have a Midianite wife? So there's a lot of midrash about this caused him, meaning Moshe, to become paralyzed and not able to say something judgmental because he was reflected on his own situation. Another explanation is, if we remember, Moshe was in the middle of his own profound grief. Miriam had just died, Aaron had just died. Not only was he experiencing the grief and sadness of that, but he was also experiencing the sadness and depression and sense of loss after striking the rock when God pronounced his own decree that Moshe could not cross over with the people and go into the promised land. So there was all kinds of things, all kinds of issues going on with Moshe that our sages say could have affected him in that moment and caused him not to speak up and not to act. Then we are introduced, the very last paragraph of last week's Parsha, we are given more of an introduction of Pinchas. We're given his genealogy. And he's introduced as Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon HaKohen. Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron the Cohen. So why is this important? So I read something very interesting this week about naming. And what I learned is that some of our sages teach that we all have three names. The one that we were given at birth, which is the name that was given to us by our parents. That could be aspirational, or because we're named after a relative that they hope that we emulate, or somebody who has qualities that they hope that we emulate. But there is a dream, a parental dream in this first naming. The second name is the name that other people give us who come to know us in our life. So it may not necessarily be a name, it could be a descriptive, and I'll go into that a little later. And then the third name is the name that we earn at the end of our life, or when we reach a crossroads and do something important and we feel a seismic shift as far as who we are. In other words, we may finally be clued into what our mission is and have clarity about who we want to be and what we should do. That's our third name. So how does this relate to Pinchas? So Pinchas's first name is Pinchas, son of Elazar, son of Aaron the Cohen. His second name is Ben Puti. So who is Puti? So our sages say, when we read about who Pinchas is, obviously he's the son of Elazar, who was the son of Aaron. So that genealogy is wonderful. It's all on the side of Israelite with great yichus. He's a Levite, but who was his mother? So the Midrash says that his mother was a daughter of Yitro, who was also called Putiel. And if he was a daughter of, if his mother was a daughter of Yitro, that means that on one side of the family, he was also Midianite. So what does that mean in terms of how others would look at him? So the Midrash says that when this was going on, when he was acting in his vigilante way, which we'll talk about a little more later, that he was surrounded by Israelites that were saying, what nerve he had to act in that way? Who authorized him? There was no judge. There was no trial. There were no witnesses testifying. Why was he acting that way? And where did he get the chutzpah to do what he did after all? And here's the important part. He is Ben Puti. He is the son of a Midianite, a son of a person who was an idol worshiper herself, his mother, who offered up fatted calves for sacrifice. So this is the second version of a person's name, meaning the Israelites did not look at him as Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the Kohen, but they named him Pinchas ben Puti as a slur and slander against him, referring to the idol worship reputation in his family. So this introduction is interesting because we know that Pinchas stood up from amid the assembly when Moshe was unable to say anything or do anything, and everyone was weeping. And he literally took a spear and he speared through Zimri and Cosby, and that stopped the plague. So what does that tell us? That tells us that God approved of his actions. So as much as we don't like to take the law into our own hands, in this particular situation, we read in Torah that God approved. So Hazal go to great lengths to discuss whether or not Pinchas acted righteously or not. If you've been part of a Torah study group, you've had this discussion yourself. In my group, we discuss it every year. But we know sometimes that desperate times call for desperate measures. And I believe, and a lot of Hazal say, that Pinchas acted with a clarity of vision and a clarity of purpose. Understanding that not only was what the Israelites were doing with the Moabite women wrong, which was, we read in Torah that they were cavorting with them sexually, but especially what Zimri and Cosby did, an unholy act in a holy place that must have shocked and dismayed the people, even if they had gone along with the other type of reveling. The actions of Zimri and Cosby are distinct. As I said before, even more defiant and presented an in-your-face challenge beyond the action of, for example, the unnamed man that we read about a couple weeks ago who gathered sticks on Shabbos. And we know that that man was put to death. The stick gatherers' actions pale in comparison to what Zimri and Cosby did, because what we read into what Zimri and Cosby did was an intent to destroy the very foundations of Judaism. Coincidentally, and apropos to our Parsha this week, our sages say that that unnamed stick gatherer was in fact the father of the daughters of Zelophehad. So we have kind of a circle of completion here. But I think what was happening with Pinchas is that he understood how important the moment was and that action was necessary. He's not confused. He doesn't experience a Hamlet-like paralysis. So whether or not you are for or against his vigilantism is almost irrelevant. What is relevant is Israel came to Shittim and the people committed harlotry with the Moabite women. They eat with the Moabites at feasts celebrating their gods. They even prostrate themselves to the Moabite gods. And then they became attached to a named Moabite god We learn the name is Baal Peor. So what caused this? Is it just more anxiety about crossing the Jordan and entering the land? Or is this a symptom of the despair of those who initiated the idol worship, that they were sad, angry, and hopeless, and felt that they had nothing left to lose? And the reason why there would still be people who were sad, angry, and hopeless is that our sages tell us that the 24,000 that were killed in the plague were the very last of the generation that was destined not to cross over. So there's competing midrashim about this. Some midrash says that that generation had already died off, but there's a lot of midrashim that say that there was still some vestiges of that generation, and they were angry and hopeless, and they acted like they had nothing to lose. Also, there's a more simple explanation that I think makes sense as well, that here they are leaving the desert, leaving the confines of all the people that they knew and were familiar with, and all of a sudden they see another group of people, all these Moabite women who are dressed seductively and have the intent to seduce them, and they are overcome with desire. The Israelite men are overcome with desire, and then they act on it. So regardless of the reason, this is a profound backward step for the Israelites in many, many significant categories, mostly because of what I said before, that there are two sins for which you may lose your share in the world to come. And one is sexual immorality, and the other is idol worship. And so in a few short verses, we see at least the Israelite men succumbing to both of those. So how do we know that God approved of Pinchas's actions? Because whereas when the priesthood was set up, the line would not have gone through to him. It would go through someone else. God says, I'm going to restore the line through Pinchas so that he can become a Cohen instead of him being bypassed. And also, as I said, because God awarded him with this Brit Shalom, with the covenant of peace. Now I'll take a little bit of time and just show some connections to the daughters of Zelophehad's story. So we've read one story after another about the Israelites' fear and despair about dying in the desert. And they romanticize their life in Egypt. They want to appoint a new leader to replace Moshe, return to Egypt. In doing all that, they've slandered the land, and they've slandered Moshe, Aaron, and even God. We know they're anxious about the future, and they're backwards looking. Now come the daughters of Zelophehad with a speech and a request that God pronounces as ken, meaning yes. God says yes to what they asked for. Everything that the Israelites are saying they don't want to do or don't appreciate, the daughters of Zelophehad come forward and say, we do cherish this. We cherish the land. We want our heritage in the land. We don't want our father's name to be lost. Contrast this with the complainers saying they want to go back to Egypt. This is the daughters of Zelophehad saying, we want to go to Eretz Israel. We want to honor our father. We want a heritage there. So according to Aviva Zornberg, this response by God pronouncing ken, the daughters of Zelophehad speak justly, speak rightly, is tantamount to God saying, the law is exactly the way the daughters of Zelophehad say it. So in this way, we learn that the daughters of Zelophehad are also co-authors of Torah. God hears their idea, agrees with it, and changes God's law, conforming it to what the daughters of Zelophehad asked for.